earlier that I was really exhausted most of the day, but I just became much more energized and the excitement of this session. So welcome to today's structured conversation from SAAL, Assessment Professional Journeys, a lens on equity. My name is Renée Delgado-Riley, and I'm the Director of Student Life Assessment and Research at the University of Oregon, and I'll serve as your moderator today. On behalf of the SAAL Professional Development Committee, I want to thank you for joining us. We're very committed to involve, feature, and represent diverse perspectives in a lot of our professional development offerings. So in order to live and breathe this in action, the Professional Development Committee today has brought together some diverse racial and ethnic identities to serve on a panel to talk about their assessment journeys and the positionality that they've had in their student affairs assessment work. So a few logistics before we get started. We encourage you to engage in this session via the chat function of Zoom. We encourage you to participate, whether it's asking follow-up questions, comments, and just engaging that way. We intentionally made the session 90 minutes today to ensure that we provide the space and time to hear from our panelists, as well as provide the opportunity for you to interact with them. We want to create this community-oriented space, and we would hope that we would be able to ask you for some simple ground rules as we engage in this very important discussion today. Is we hope that you'll be present. We know a lot of us are working from home or just juggling and balancing a lot of things. And so it's just best to keep your microphones muted, but feel free to keep your camera on or turn it off. I think the advantage of this session today is if you keep it on the speaker view, you'll be able to see our panelists as they talk rather than the gallery view in Zoom. We ask that you listen with an open mind. And I want to first thank Dr. Carrie Klima, the Associate Director of Assessment and Evaluation at California State University, Long Beach, for helping coordinate the session. We started coordinating this back in the summer, and we're so excited that it's coming to fruition. And Carrie will also be serving as a support in the background, helping us manage that function. So as our panelists are speaking or as I'm moderating, she's going to be in the background making sure that we're interacting with the Zoom. And so we really encourage you to interact that way. So on to our wonderful panelists. We are just so grateful to have three amazing panelists today to share in their professional journeys. First, we're grateful to have Dr. Megan Bell, who's the Interim Assistant Vice-Chancellor at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, who's been there for 10 years providing leadership in the Division of Student Affairs, as well as directing their assessment initiatives. She also previously volunteered for the SAAL board as the secretary, and in addition is an assistant professor in their College of Education, teaching student affairs and higher ed. And we're so excited to have you, so thank you for that. We'd also like to welcome Dr. Lashon Benjamin, who's currently serving as the Regional Coordinator for the Ministry of Youth Development and National Service, which is a ministry of the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Lashon served as a doctoral-level research assistant at Central Michigan University and as assessment officer at the Accreditation Council of Trinidad and Tobago. So thank you. We're excited to have you. And lastly, we're excited to have Angelica Moreno, who's the Manager of Student Affairs Assessment and Evaluation at Metropolitan State University in Denver. She was born and raised in El Paso, Texas, is a first-generation Latina that has been working to support and advocate for minoritized populations in student affairs for 17 years. That's really impressive. She's also a key member in student affairs leadership team, making sure that data-informed decision-making is happening and is supported in all their programs and initiatives. So thank you to each of you for joining us and being willing to give your time and share your professional journey. So as any good assessment organization, we have a few outcomes that we hope that you all will engage with us as a result of this conversation. We're hoping you'll have a new openness to perspectives. We hope that you'll interact respectively and substantially with those different from yourself. And really at the end of this, we hope that we'll all harness the power of equity as a source for creativity and inspiration for future collaboration and support as it pertains to student affairs assessment. So we're really excited about this. So thank you all for joining us, and we can stop sharing the screen. Thank you. Awesome. And so I'm just going to switch to speaker view so I can see our amazing panelists. And if we could just mute ourselves, that would be great. Awesome. So as a native New Mexican, while completing my master's degree, I was beginning my first role in student affairs assessment as a professional intern. And I was fortunate at the time to work at a minority serving, Hispanic serving institution that was also a Research 1 classification. Thus, a lot of my colleagues and the students we served came from diverse backgrounds. However, I had a hard time fitting in professionally, battling with my vernacular and academic engagement. You see, New Mexico historically had an indigenous population, but then the Spanish crown was there for 300 years. And so the dominant language of my ancestors was Spanish and Pueblo languages. So when the Anglos came and the United States declared New Mexico a territory in the late 19th century, my ancestors were all forced to speak English. And they were kind of reinforced with the mentality that if they didn't learn English, that they would suffer from economic challenges and they wouldn't grow as a state. So up until my parents, their first language was Spanish and some of the native languages. And so because they didn't want us to be made fun of and they didn't want me and my siblings to experience the same racial slurs and be made fun of, they actually taught us English. And so embedding this, teaching us English as a second language, emerged this very unique Spanglish and this very unique vernacular here in the state of New Mexico. And it wasn't until I got to higher education that people made fun of the way I spoke. And I had to work really hard on figuring out how to speak in academic terms that were acceptable to the academy. So looking back on that, I was really pissed off that I had kind of shoved this part of me aside for fear of being made fun of or having my writing be completely redlined and marked up. I used to feel embarrassed, and trust me, every day I still get corrected, usually by my white male coworkers, about something that's wrong with the writing that I share or something as I speak. So however, today is not about me, but as I reflect on this journey, I'm reminded every day as an assessment professional that I'm constantly being challenged by the hegemonic norms of the academy, constantly having to balance my authentic self with being an assessment professional. Sometimes those things jive together, sometimes they don't. And as I said, the session's not about me, but I want to preface with a story to remind us that certain ethnic and racial experiences can impact the way that we interact as professionals in the assessment world. So with that, can each of our panelists please introduce themselves, tell us what has been your professional journey in student affairs and or higher ed assessment, and just tell us a little bit, how has it been to be you in this profession? And we can start with, I don't know, let's go with Angie, if you feel comfortable.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Renee. And thank you to all who helped organize this session. It's been really exciting and a little nerve-wracking, to be honest, to kind of put myself out there in this way. This is my first time kind of engaging with the SAAL community. And so I'm really thankful for the opportunity. But I have a pretty long journey. As Renee mentioned, I've been in student affairs for 17 years now, and it's had its ups and downs, but I wanted to look at three kind of formative areas of my journey through student affairs and assessment. And I had Renee introduce me as born and raised in El Paso, Texas, because that is a huge part of my identity. For those of you who don't know, El Paso is over 80% Hispanic, Latino. It's right on the border of Texas and New Mexico and Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. And so there's just so much going on there, right? It's a bicultural city. And growing up there, I never had to think about my identity. I never had to think about the fact that I was Hispanic or Latina. I was raised to think of myself as Mexican American, but I really didn't know what that meant. And so I wanted to put that out there because those were the formative years, right? My from birth to about 18 years old when I decided I needed to leave Texas, and I went to school in Minnesota. Why Minnesota? I'm not sure, but that's where I ended up. And I knew what I was getting into. I knew I was going to a historically white institution where I was going to be one of a handful of Latinas. So it wasn't that much of a culture shock, but I think what happened there is that in my time as a student, I did a lot of programming. I was in student government. I worked in our multicultural student services office, and with the different various programs that we were having, I often wondered, what are students leaving with, right? We're hosting this event based off of my culture, and what is it that they're leaving with understanding about who I am as a Latina, as a Mexican American, or any of the other diversity activities that were going on? Because I want them to get past that food festival fun piece of it and really engage in the critical aspects of my culture. And it's weird as a college student that I was thinking through this and having those thoughts, because that's kind of my connection to assessment, is that student learning has come from. And then the third part that I wanted to share in my professional journey is that I had, I think, a blessing to me. One of my first professional jobs was at a small private college in Wisconsin. And their mission was driven really by discovering your personal gifts and using those gifts to affect the world positively. And in other words, thinking of vocation is what they really focused on. And so I've always been invested in what are the gifts that I have? What are my strengths, right? Having that asset-based approach. And what can I do to create a better world? And so I take that with me everywhere that I go. And in the first 15 plus years of my journey in student affairs, I worked to directly support minoritized students through peer mentor programs, support programs, assisting with campus climate surveys, and then ending up in a role where I was doing the nitty gritty to really assess the student learning between leadership and inclusion programs. So I've always been curious. I've always wanted to make sure that the programs, services, resources that I was offering up to students was having an impact. And so that's a snapshot, a little bit of my journey in student affairs.
Thank you, Angie, for sharing that. And El Paso is not very far from where I originate from, so I completely get it. So I'd like to move on to Lashon, if you don't mind going and sharing what has been your journey in student affairs assessment and or higher ed assessment, and what has it been, or what does it mean to be you, and what has it been, your journey like?
Thanks very much, Renee. Hi, everyone, and greetings from Trinidad. I've been in the field of education for over a decade now, and it really started in the K-12 classroom with a focus on math special education. Before that, I would have pursued a bachelor's degree in economics and social policy. So I was always kind of driven by that idea of, okay, thinking about the groups that are most vulnerable in any activity. So when I entered the classroom, that was always kind of at the forefront for me. And then I would have kind of followed that up with a social justice master's in education. So again, it was kind of more reinforced, and it has kind of influenced everything that I've done since then. After that, I did some work as an assessment officer within the accreditation context of Trinidad and Tobago before starting my PhD program at Central Michigan University, where I served as an assessment graduate research assistant, and that's a mouthful, right? But because of that assistantship, I was able to have a highly subsidized financial support for my doctoral studies. And I kind of did a whole bunch of assessment type activities within the realm of higher education. So that's about it.
That's a lot. Thank you for sharing that journey. I'm sure it was a bit of a shock going from Trinidad and Tobago to Central Michigan as well. So I'm sure we'll talk about that as we talk about challenges. And next, I'd like to ask Megan if you'd like to share what your journey's been like and what does it mean to be you in this profession?
Sure thing. Thanks, Renee. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I love SAAL. These are my people in student affairs. Just always have felt really connected and have been missing my time serving on the board. So thanks for having me. I, like Angie, feel a little excitement, but hesitation to talk about kind of the identity part of me, even though it really is important, I think, to my journey. So I'll say, in terms of how my identities kind of inform my perspective, I identify as multiracial. My mother's family is from Brazil. My father's family is white, from Europe. And this has, I think, been a really important part of my worldview, my research, and my approach to working with students. I'm also first generation in terms of a college degree and definitely an advanced degree. in my family. And, you know, college, my undergraduate was very transformative to me. The other part of my identity is I've always been just really good at school. That's just been my thing. And so I love learning, and I've always felt very connected to education. So as I discovered the field of student affairs as an undergrad, and just loved my college experience, I also was simultaneously having this greater awareness of what it meant to be a multiracial person in a world where it's still, the paradigm is monoracial. And so I think even today, continuing to feel that I don't 100% fit anywhere, and that I have something to kind of prove in my work. So I think I'd like to say that my ending up in working in assessment is a happy accident, but I don't think that's true. I think there's like a lot of little decisions and things that I've done along the way that have made me end up doing this work and being very passionate about it. So I just think as I got my graduate degree and started thinking about a PhD, I've always really thought that our profession was undervalued, that based on my own experience, what we do with students and the learning and the transformation that comes as a part of being in college, that we also had something to prove. So I guess I connected to that from my own personal journey into the professional. And I really wanted to do work that helped prove or show the kinds of transformations that students were having in their learning in the classroom and out of the classroom together. So I really got to be doing assessment work when I was doing my PhD, and it kind of became a thing on our campus that hadn't really been done formally, and we went through accreditation, and the focus was on co-curricular from the HLC, and our campus was a little bit unprepared, I would say, for that. And so, you know, I kind of said, I'm really invested in this work. Can I run with this? Can I develop something? Can I, you know, work on assessment and improving that in our division? And so thankfully it was on a campus where I would say our leadership maybe didn't 100% get it, but said, sure, Megan, do whatever you want to do. You're getting your PhD, go for it. And then when I was collecting my data, I actually ran into Renée. She helped me get some data, and she told me about SAAL. And that's where it really converged as I joined that organization and found a group of people who had similar values about what student affairs work is and the kind of learning that we care about in our profession, and wanting to connect being a scholar with a practitioner and using some of the skills from my PhD into my practitioner work. And maybe helping some of those folks who aren't really excited about assessment finding value in it. And so that's where I ended up, how kind of it all came together. And I think who I am and how I show up and my identities really, in my mind, as I reflect over the last 20 years, really, it makes sense that this is where I've ended up, and that I get to help coordinate assessment initiatives on our campus. So that's trying to put 20 years of me reflecting on myself and my professional journey together. I tried to stay under 5 minutes, but I don't know if I made it. So thank you.
You're wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Angie, and thank you, Lashon. It sounds like at least what I'm hearing emerge from your all's professional journeys in this world is the necessity for finding engagement or getting involved, getting connected, finding those learning communities, finding those communities where you feel comfortable to reinforce your values that matter, and really sharing those gifts to the next generation. And so that was really interesting to see the whole giving back piece. So that was nice. So getting into some more challenging things, and maybe we'll start with Megan and then kind of mix it up here. But let's talk a little bit more about what have been some of the challenges. Let's talk about some concrete challenges that you have encountered, either related to equity or related to your own racial ethnic identity in your current role or in roles that you've had. And what are some strategies, and how did you navigate these challenges? So let's talk a little bit about these challenges, and then how did you navigate them? So we'll start with you, Megan, first, if you don't mind.
Sure. So the greatest challenge that comes to mind is that as a multiracial person, I sometimes don't feel it doesn't feel fully okay to me to embrace an identity as a person of color, or now a BIPOC person. I present to some people as white and can be white passing, and I'm very aware of that. But who I am and what I've experienced as a Latina also is really critical to me. So I kind of feel like I live in these two worlds all of the time. And if you look at any of the multiracial literature, there's this idea of the borderlands and how you're kind of going in and out on the margins. And I feel like that's kind of the space that I've always been in. So I always have like a foot in multiple places. And even as an administrator, I also have a faculty role. So I ride this administrator and faculty duality, my multiple identity duality. And so I think it just makes navigating some of the conversations around equity really interesting. And I have seen over the last 20 years that there's more space for an acknowledgement of multiracial identity, but we still operate a lot of times out of a monoracial paradigm. And I'm passionate about who doesn't get included or gets lumped in with other people. When are our students not, because of the way that we categorize and count and evaluate what assumptions are made. I think I'm just very aware of those challenges when it comes to this kind of work. I'm really connected to hearing people's stories and making sure their voices are included, because even within our, when we group people together, there are so many differences within that experience. So that's really my challenge, is just feeling like, how do I show up as me, push the agenda for equity, kind of understand the privilege I have, but also the connection that I feel to our underrepresented students on campus. How do I advocate, have a voice, make space for voice? Those are some of the challenges that I'm always thinking about in this kind of work. I will say that I think, and as I've done some research with multiracial individuals, the strategies or the advantage is being able to see things from multiple lenses. I think that's a real strength that I possess, it's taken me a long time to understand that that's a strength, that I can see things from multiple viewpoints and try to use that in assessment work. And in research. So I think sometimes we think there's like one objective truth or reality when we're doing this kind of work, and there's not. There's always multiple perspectives, always subjectivity based on how we show up and who we are. And I'm trying to make space for that continually. And but I will say I do feel sometimes like an imposter. Even though I've been on my campus for 10 years and I have great relationships with people, it's just interesting. Sometimes I take for granted how people perceive me, or what they think I am. And the conversations change depending on who's in the room, I've noticed. So that's just something that I continue to work on. And I'm not sure that it's work that will ever be completely finished for me.
I like that you're describing it as an active process and something that you're consistently engaging with. And I really do like how this lends itself really nice to the methodology behind socially just assessment and culturally responsive assessment. So thank you for sharing that, Megan. So we'll go on to Lashon. Give us some perspective on your challenges that you've encountered and what have you done to navigate through some of those experiences?
Yeah, so I think for me, because my family, they have been in the US for many decades, and I probably left this out in my earlier response. Having started undergrad in the US, pursued a master's in the US and then a doctoral degree, but still remaining very close to my my birth country. I often always see myself as being not just being Black and being Caribbean and all these things coming together. And that idea of immigrant identity and how it, how it affects students and the opportunities they have. And in my case specifically, not always knowing the right thing or the right step or the right procedure or what's next. I think for me, that was probably a big challenge as both as a student and even in transitioning into my professional career. Not always having structured mentorship opportunities and stuff like that to kind of model and mirror ways of being or next steps or anything like that. And because that was a challenge and I was, openly aware of that, I was always happy and excited to be inquisitive and to ask as many questions, not feeling, intimidated when I wasn't aware of things. And I think I took that from being a student into my professional life because I knew that that was the only way that I was going to be successful and be able to kind of address these hurdles and to kind of get over them to be successful. So I've always been, looking for opportunities to better understand things and to make meaning of concepts around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also being very much willing to share, well, okay, this might be an international perspective on it, or this is how a student who, may not have gone through traditional, I don't know, K-12 or earlier education in the US, how they might perceive it, and, kind of bringing those things to the table. I think that's always been great for me as a professional, but also, on the student lens of things.
I really like that idea, Lashon, of just that self-assurance piece. I think is so powerful to become that self-advocate, to then challenge yourself of learning more and engaging more and just looking at different perspectives. So I really like how you shared that. I think that's a really powerful message as well. So we'll go on to Angie to talk about the challenges you've experienced as it relates to racial and ethnic identity, and what kind of things have you done to navigate these challenges?
Sure, thanks. On a personal note in this area, I think I've been battling imposter syndrome my entire life. As I mentioned, growing up, I never thought about my identity in El Paso, and I want to say it wasn't until post-graduation that I moved to East Texas, which is very different from West Texas, that I started to realize, wait, I'm the only female in this room. I'm the only Latina in this room. I'm the only person under the age of 40 in this room trying to write a diversity plan, right? Like filled with a room, sitting in a room with a bunch of old white men, to be honest. And so the imposter syndrome has always been an issue for me. I often question whether or not what I'm doing is the right way to be doing it. And so that's definitely a challenge that I've encountered. On the flip side of things, in a professional setting, a challenge that I've often encountered, especially working with diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that when we present results, when it's something that's a report broken down and disaggregated by demographics, the challenge that I see is that oftentimes those results are questioned as not being valid, as not being real, because it's not based off of the majority experience. And so I think back to an article that Dr. Sean Harper wrote in 2015, questioning why universities would spend so much money to do campus climate surveys and not do anything with that information, right? And so it's, how do we then get people to invest in wanting to create change at an institution when they can't even recognize that those results are true and real and tell a story of somebody's experience at their institution? How I've navigated that, the imposter syndrome. I think I'm finally at a place at an institution where I'm seeing a lot of strong Latinas in positions of power. And I'm gonna latch on to that. I'm new to this university, but I'm gonna try to make those connections and get some guidance, because mentorship is something that I came to late in my process of development, but I know how important it is. And so just recently, in the last, I'd say 5-6 years, I've had some really awesome mentors that have guided me. And then I also, on the institutional side of things, I want folks to realize that as a response to reports or data, as we start to implement interventions and our support structures, I think it's good to balance it with saying that, like, no matter what it is that we do to help support X student, whatever that is going to help the rest of our students regardless of that intervention. And so whether we decide to like invest in intrusive advising, we're not just going to do that for our BIPOC students, we're going to do that for everybody, and it's going to help everybody across the board. So it's like, I can't think of that saying, lifting boats and stuff. I can't remember what that saying is. But there's an amazing story in a book called What If? Stories to Spark Diversity Dialogue that talks, it's a fishing story. I don't know anything about fish. That talks about, yeah, if you just create the right environment to help people to thrive and survive and thrive, then that's going to help the whole environment, not just the one.
I love that idea of, that contextual piece. And I think, at least, reflecting on my own personal journey, is there is a lot of community and collective kind of experiences I've had, and being thrown into the academy is sometimes very individualistic. And so definitely being challenged by that can be really hard to navigate. So thank you all for sharing your challenges. And so in order
Renée,
to,
could I add one more thing that I thought of when Angie was talking, which I actually wrote down in my notes and then didn't say. Another huge challenge when Angie was talking about people not believing your data, like what you find about the experiences of our underrepresented or historically underserved populations. The other pressure that I find a lot is the pressure to put like a positive spin, or when something goes out publicly to the campus and it's not what we were hoping to find in our data, or hear from students, like, oh, well, we can't share that in that way. We should probably reframe that. So I think one challenge I'm continuing to have is, like, we have to say what's really happening, even the not good parts with our students, if we're going to make any, if we're going to be able to change our campuses, like kind of putting the spin on it. And I get why there's a lot of pressure with our board of regents and, public pressure. I get all of the dynamics politically that we're facing, but I also think that if we can't really talk about the actuality of the things that are not going well, then we're not going to be able to come together. And it's not to ignore the things that are positive or the improvements or the progress we have made, but there's still a lot of work to be done, and we have to be able to talk about that honestly and transparently, in my mind. So I don't know that I have any ideas. If someone has ideas on how to navigate that, I mean, I'm trying my best to push where I can and push the agenda. And, if we have to put something out publicly, that's fine, but can we have an internal conversation that's more real? So that's the other challenge that I'm working on. I just don't have any real good successful initiatives or strategies to overcome that quite yet. But I wanted to put it out there as a talking point for us to think about.
No, I really appreciate that, Megan, and thanks for sharing that, because I truly believe you can't grow and develop as an organization if you're not like allowing your place to be vulnerable and be able to acknowledge where you're currently at in order to grow and develop. And I think, you know, every campus is different, but at least on our campus, what we're experiencing is we've acknowledged, okay, we suck at these different things. We don't do a very good job supporting, you know, our BIPOC students. But I think what we're being challenged with is, okay, what do we do about it? And how do we actually like live and breathe that? And so it's definitely really difficult conversations. And I put in the chat here that I feel like a lot always falls on you when people look at you and lean on you to do this diversity and equity work. And I call it, and I know I didn't come up with this, but cultural taxation is real and it's very exhausting. And how can we carry this work forward? So I appreciate you sharing that. So if we don't mind, we're going to transition a little bit to, okay, we've talked about our journeys in student affairs assessment. We've talked about the challenges that we've encountered, but now let's talk about this bigger community oriented thing of, what are the most critical changes and actions that we need to take to face the future effectively? And how can we really advance these equity issues in student affairs and or higher ed assessment and research today? What do we need to do? And so I guess maybe we'll start with Lashon and then maybe go to Megan and then end with Angie on this question. So what are the most critical changes that we need to take and do?
I think it'll be very useful for us to take a step back and kind of think about how we collect the data or data that we use, what is considered quote unquote good data, good methods, appropriate, that sort of stuff. And I speak a little bit about that because of one of the main initiatives that we did at Central. We moved away from heavy surveying because a lot of the student population they were survey fatigued and questionnaire fatigued. And even when we used a survey, it was homegrown and, you know, specifically for the incoming first year students of that year that we created it. But in administering that survey, we kind of took a 360 approach as to how we did it. So we created space for students to take the survey in a place that was more inclusive. They could ask questions, we could provide assistance and kind of walk them through. Because we knew we at that time, the data that was coming in, it wasn't great. They weren't spending, you know, enough time going through the items and stuff like that. And even when we crafted the items, we made sure to put some of the responses that were probably less popular to the top, little techniques like that. So students would know, okay, I'm represented here, or this option is here. So that was one thing. On the other side, recognizing how fatigued students were with surveys, we looked to more focus groups and interview type methods for data collection. And it was almost as though it shone a bright light on data collection within the context of co-curricular program assessment and so forth. So students, in my opinion, felt as though they had an opportunity to talk about their experiences and somebody was there to listen. And they were so much engaged in the process that they were telling us that, you know, we really need to hear what comes out of this. We would love to hear about your findings. And in my experience, you don't always get that buy-in. So that was great. And I remember a lot of the talk was around first generation students. And when we did another project under that assessment partnership that we had, one of the things that came out was this idea that students who were continuing generations of college students, there was this unique thing that they didn't even feel like if it was an asset to them, because their experience in college was so different from their parents that they couldn't even like benefit from the fact they felt as though they couldn't benefit from that kind of family knowledge and capital and so forth. So I think outside of like more qualitative approaches, it's difficult to kind of get that insight and stuff like that. So for me, in thinking about the future, I'm a big proponent in looking at what methods we use to collect data, and even when we use traditional approaches, how can we make it more accessible, and how can we make it more inclusive along the way, so it tells a better story, a more realistic story, a more inclusive story. Like, those are the things that kind of come to mind for me, at least, when I think about the future and equitable assessment and data collection.
I just really love that comment of using other methods fused with traditional as well, because multiple methodologies are so critical to helping us understand so many different things. And I'm a huge proponent that, data only tells you so much, quantitative does. And it's really nice to have those qualitative pieces to contextualize it. And what I've always found with focus groups, and why I feel like I've been leaning on them even more and more, even though they're very taxing and time consuming, is I feel like it's not just an opportunity for you to hear from students and get their voice, but it's also an opportunity for you to engage and connect with the students in a way that maybe they wouldn't traditionally connect with the institution. And I've actually, out of focus groups that I've led on our campus, I've actually had students approach me about career development opportunities or different ways to get engaged in research. And to me, it's just a really cool way to mentor students. And that's like the byproduct of engaging in this focus group, is you get connected to another individual in the institution that you wouldn't traditionally get engaged with. So I really love that you were able to share that, Lashon, and I couldn't echo and support that anymore. So moving to Megan, what do you think are some critical changes and actions that we need to take in this work, and how can we really advance these equity issues in student affairs assessment?
Well, I think just connecting the two, it's really exciting to see a lot of the discussions about critical assessment and socially just assessment, because in my mind, they're so connected. But I think on our campus, our culture right now is that they almost seem like they're in these different spheres. And there's a huge push right now around EDI initiatives and work, some on our campus, some coming from the CU system. But I'm thinking, so we need to invest in assessment and evaluation so that we can like we just got some funds from the system office, and on the town hall today, what was asked to the chancellors, what we're going to use them for, and some are being set aside for a renovation and expansion of our multicultural services office. But he said, we're evaluating that. And so I'm thinking, cool. So that means we should, let's look at all the data that we have and figure out what do we still need so that we can be more effective in our EDI work. But it still seems like they're just viewed on my campus as very separate worlds almost. So I think for the future, kind of connecting those things or helping figure out how we, those don't operate as separate. They inform each other in a very powerful way. And then I think the other thing that kind of like what Lashon was saying was still the thing that my mantra is stop framing students, our underrepresented students, our historically underserved students from a deficit perspective. Still the way that we talk about our students, sometimes I know it's not intentional, but it's from this very deficit model. And it drives me nuts. And I've just been on this mission to, even the way you ask the questions, even the way you frame the research question or what you're trying to evaluate. I mean, just the best intentioned intervention, if it comes from this place of our students are lacking something, or they're at risk, or they're, all the other code words we use, at the end of the day, it's just not, we're going to stay in the old way. I think our universities aren't going to change in the way that they need to systemically to support all students, if that's our mindset still. And it's really hard, I think, to get out of that mindset. So those are the two things that I would like to continue our field to continue to work on in the future.
I think that latter point is so powerful, Megan, and that's kind of fueled the motivation behind a lot of my own work, understanding psychosocial factors and really looking beyond the unchangeable things that our students bring to the table, but instead of looking at their resiliency, their self-assurance, their connection to community, and their feelings of sense of belonging, and how they can utilize those strengths to then engage in our campus and co-curricular offerings. And that's been a huge motivation behind a lot of the work that I do, because I'm like, you can't change the fact that our students are coming with these certain demographic factors. Like, let's focus on what they are bringing and how we can connect them in the best way to support them based on their unique experiences. And I know that that hasn't always been an easy journey for me in those administrative conversations, because they often just want to look at student success and retention and graduation rates, right?
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for sharing that. It's very powerful. So Angie, what do you think are the most critical changes and actions that we need to take? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I might take this in a different path, just because of the way that I think and the strengths that I have. You know, I tend to be a learner. I love to read, and I could sit down with a good journal and be good, right? And then I also need to know context. And when you think of assessment, the way I approach of assessment is to understand, what is the why? Why are we doing this? What do we want to understand? And I would hope most of us are on the same page. But I also like to make sure that I'm connecting it to theory. I love theory. I love how theory describes student development in higher education, but the issue that I have that I think we need to kind of push the boundary on is understanding that there are other modes of student development that need to be taught. At least for me in my graduate program, I did not have any courses that went into like intersectionality and or queer theory, indigenous frameworks of thinking. And so the more and more that we can try to utilize critical frameworks of student development in our work of assessment to build out our programs, I think is going to be key. Actually, I feel like I'm guilty of it as well. And so I'm just now catching up. And in the spirit of my learner identity, I will be reading this over the holiday, the next couple of months, hopefully. So it's Rethinking College Student Development Theory Using Critical Frameworks. That is my to-do over the next couple of months. And I'm hoping that will help me in the work that I'm doing to help prepare our student affairs professionals at the university that I am at currently. And then using those theories to create new ways of thinking and create, push the boundaries on what it is that we think is possible at our universities. I think an example that I was thinking of that was kind of mind-blowing to me now, but now I'm like, why didn't we think of this before? Is that at my current university, prior to my arriving, there was talk and a lot of groundwork being done to create a multicultural student services center. And so as that was progressing, there was a new vice president that came on board, and his thinking was, well, we already have, not being there, I'm not sure what the process of the thinking was, to be honest, but in traditional modes of student support on college campuses, there's an Office of Student Activities or an Office of Student Engagement, Student Leadership, something like that. And oftentimes, at least in my experience, that office had a value of inclusion and equity and diversity and approached their work in that way. At my current university, they've kind of just flipped the switch and said, okay, we have this Center for Multicultural Engagement and Inclusion that is going to oversee all the programs that student activities did in the past, but we're going to frame it so that our primary motivation to do this work is because of equity and inclusion, and then we're going to add this layer of leadership and engagement. And so I think just thinking outside of the box and trying to push the boundary on the ways that we traditionally approach student affairs is really key.
I think that's really important, and I appreciate you sharing that. And I love that you're challenging yourself and you're using the winter time to engage in learning. And I love that that's come up from all our panelists today about making sure that we're always continuing learning and rethinking and using reflection. And I do like the idea. I mean, when I first started as a student in student affairs, it was the traditional approach of, we have these experiences, let's wait for students to show up, rather than being more intentional and being more thoughtful in how we coordinate and develop these programs. So thank you for sharing that. So also I want to encourage everyone in the chat, if there's any, critical changes that you think need to happen. This equity work as part of our professional development committee is going to be continuing on with SAAL. So we're going to do more of these sessions. So all the information you put in the chat we'll be using for our planning purposes. So as we were planning this session, Carrie and I were thinking about how can we elevate diverse voices in the field of student affairs assessment and higher ed assessment, and how can we share that unique journey that we've all had and how we've just used the social identity and navigated the challenges of higher ed, but then also how we've infused strategies and how we've given these. I really like Angie's quote of giving those gifts and sharing those gifts. I think that's really powerful. So the last kind of question, major question I have, and maybe we'll just start with Angie because you're on the screen as you talked last, is what's one piece of advice, or multiple pieces of advice, but what's some advice that you would give other diverse racial and ethnic folks who want to pursue a career in student affairs assessment or higher ed assessment? What are some pieces of advice?
As I mentioned, my journey has been all over the place. And so something that I learned early on is understanding my own personal values and how they connect to the institution. And so I've, in all honesty, been at like 6 different campuses. I was mentioning as we were prepping for this session that I finally feel that I'm at an institution where my personal values align with the institutional values. And so I share that because I think as, for various reasons, I think folks feel like they need to stay in a place and commit to an institution regardless of whether or not those two connect. And I feel like my values have always needed to be in the forefront. So I'd say just don't be afraid to do that reflection, to find out whether or not an institution is the right place for you. I actually remember one place that I worked at where there was this constant tension. It just wasn't right. And I had an amazing mentor just ask me the question like, well, do you want to be here? Is this where you want to be doing the work? And I was adamant. I was like, yes, this is where I want to be. This is where I need to be. And it came at the end of the day and I'm like, I don't need to be here. I don't need to be doing the work for this institution if they're not willing to do the work themselves. And so it did take me a couple of different moves to different universities to get to the place where I am now. And I don't think you need to be afraid of that.
And that's part of the, being able to understand that and recognize that you can move on and you can grow and develop. And sometimes that's a hard place to be. I've been in organizations that have been very similar, not being supportive and with my own value set, and definitely really interesting and challenging and stressful. I internalize a lot. So that was really some of my most challenging times professionally. So Lashon, what do you think, what would be your advice? You want to share that with us?
I definitely echo what Angie had to say about that willingness to get up and move from time to time. And I think in doing that, I've always been able to kind of like keep my tools sharp, because it's always, using these tools and these skills within different contexts, different environment, different institution, different countries and stuff like that. So that would be one part of my piece of advice is to, be flexible and scan your environment. It's a great field. And I think outside of a field, it's a great skill to have, right? To understand assessments and evaluation and stuff like that, because it's so transferable within higher ed and outside of it, right? And, with COVID now, and we know terms in the job markets, and sometimes you really just do have to be flexible. So that's one part, right? But I think second to that is to have and to hone that piece of yourself that is inquisitive, and be encouraged to reach out to folks who have done this sort of work. Send out an email and kind of see what you get from that, because I found just over the last 3 or 4 years, persons that are really huge and I'm going to use my area of research, they were so willing to chat and so willing to, give 10 minutes of their time. And these are what I would consider, really huge names. And even working with my faculty partners at my doctoral institution, they were so willing to give this information and to share. And based on that, I was able to make certain decisions. And I think if I had to kind of circle that piece of advice around, that would be the end piece. Feel free to reach out and, see what's out there, see what other persons are saying, and, use that to inform your decision as well.
And SAAL is a great community for that. I'm actually just wanting to acknowledge that in the chat, we have some questions just asking about some culturally relevant campus climate pieces around co-curricular. And it's just so nice to see you all engaging and supporting one another. So SAAL is a great place to do that very work. And so thank you, Lashon, for reminding us about how important it is to build that network and support that community. And Megan, what's some of your advice?
Well, it was very much in line with that thought about finding a community, finding your people. And sometimes I totally agree with Angie about it's very hard if your values don't align with the university. And if you, in your own, who you are and your identities and what you believe is not, that's such a hard place to be. But I do know sometimes you don't have the option to move. And so what do you do then? If you can't in the immediate, look for something new. And I think it's really finding your people that feed you. And I believe very much in, I have these little groups and pockets of folks, some that kind of are my people around my identity. Some that are like SAAL is really where I do come together with other people that are learners. Like Angie said, I'm a learner that, are pushing inquiry and focused on student learning and are like some of the smartest people. I've learned so much from this organization, especially if you're kind of newly in a role with assessment and need to start something. This is a really good place. And I have found, like Lashon, that people are very willing to share, talk you through whatever challenges you're facing. How do you start an assessment committee? How do you start the program, CAS review process? Like I'm asked to assess this functional area. I have no idea. What do I do? Equity, I also think it's about community. I also do think that if you're going to be in this particular part of the field, there is a responsibility to continue to learn, to know where the scholarship is. I'm not suggesting everyone needs to get a terminal degree, but I do think you need to be pushing and understanding kind of where the field is. And if the degree isn't your thing, like where else can you get that? Can you take the free course that SAAL, that's a little plug, right? That SAAL has offered a couple of times now. Can you, audit a class if you don't want to do the whole degree? Can you join a knowledge community? Like where can you kind of continue to challenge yourself in terms of the scholarship that is taking place in our field? Because I think as a practitioner, we can get just sucked into a lot of especially right now, responding to things. And I think feeding yourself, the academic part, the learner part is really important in all of student affairs, but I think in this part in particular. So I will say that I have found having my PhD and going through that process, I think really did help me. I'm not saying everyone has to, I'm just saying for me personally, it was rewarding and it has helped provide me access to different research projects and been able to be involved at a strategic level in the university, in my university. So happy to also to talk to anyone who's interested in that journey as well, because it's hard, but it was rewarding for me, and it has definitely informed my work.
No, thank you for sharing that. I love the idea of pushing yourself to focus on that scholarship. And a question that I didn't prepare for the panelists, and you all don't have to answer this, so you could just chime in, but I think it's a very important topic as we talk about equity and inclusion as it pertains to our own positionalities in the assessment journeys that you all have been sharing, is how do you nurture yourself in staying, you know, on track and staying with it, because it can be very exhausting. So I guess whoever wants to answer, like, what do you do to nurture yourself? I mean, I've heard themes of continuing to learn, but like, what are some other things that we can share with our other colleagues about how to continue this work and not get burnt out, essentially?
I'll jump in really quick because since leaving El Paso, I very much miss my community and I miss being around people who look like me. And so something that I found specifically in Colorado is a group called COSEAL. So it's the Colorado, I'm going to mess up this acronym so badly, the Colorado Council of something education advancing Latinxes. And it's a professional group of folks who all identified as Latinx, Hispanic, Latinos, that come together probably every 2 months, every 3 months or so, half day. That actually happened maybe about a week or two ago, was the fall meeting, member meeting. And it's so refreshing to connect with people who understand, right? Who understand the journey and the challenges and the amazingness of our culture, even if it is every 3 months or so. So that's kind of how I nurture myself. And I definitely just echo the resources through SAAL, because even the listserv, my goodness, I have found so many connections and resources. And I had asked a question about a survey at one point and I got like 6 different responses. And so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Stuff is out there and people are willing to share. And I love that about SAAL.
Thank you, Angie, for sharing. Do any of our other panelists want to share?
I really have to go back to the students and get connected to the students when I'm feeling like just, I don't know, tired or questioning if anything I'm doing is making any kind of difference. So I'm fortunate to be able to teach at my institution, and that always, while it's adding a thing, it always like kind of recenters the bigger why of why I started this. So if you're not able to do that, you know, Renee's suggestion of focus groups or just advising a student organization or just, I don't know, I always just have like a breath of fresh air because I just don't get that as much anymore. So I have to create it for myself. Direct connection with students because they're awesome. And I love teaching the graduate students in the master's program, like the brand new ones that are coming into the field. Such energy and optimism, and just what we need to hold on to in tough times. So that's what I do. And otherwise it, you know, it sounds dumb, but I just have to walk away sometimes. Like I just have to, I've gotten a lot better about, I'm taking my vacation. When I'm on vacation, I'm on vacation. Like I've been working on that a lot the last few years, and It makes me better professional when I can disconnect. So I hope that folks can continue to do that. We really need to do that for each other and help each other do that to be well.
No, wellness is so important. Thank you, Megan. And Lashon, did you want to share anything?
Sure, I'm happy to share on that. And I agree again with Megan. My area of research is PhD and doctoral level programs and students, right? So sometimes you just get consumed with that one population. And for me, it's always, trying to stay connected and in a fun way, not always within the context of teaching and learning, but, just socializing and laughing and fun and that sort of thing. And this could be with learners and children as young as 8 or 10 or 5, just really not having that almost strict and calculated lens towards everything, laughing a little bit, engaging with persons who aren't in the field and, kind of looking at how they perceive some of the same issues that I contend with on a daily basis. How does that look within HR, or how does it look in engineering, those sorts of things, to just kind of keep, that multiple perspective, because while it, higher ed and students and their learning take up a great part of our day, it's not the entire world, right? There's so much more going on out there. And I think it's very helpful when I hear from others and when I engage with learners or young children outside of teaching and learning. So I think that has been very helpful for me in remaining sane and calm and fun and not losing the kind of jovial part, because sometimes the work does get heavy, right? And I'm always happy when I have that experience whenever it presents itself, or when I initiate it, I should say.
No, I think that's so important, Lashon, to remember we're humans, right? We're not these linear little creatures and cogs in a machine. We're humans, and we're very dynamic, and there's people behind this role. And it's important to focus on the people doing this work as well. And it's important to connect on that human level. So thank you for that. I'm a huge proponent when it comes to, even just before any meeting I have, just do a quick check-in on how everyone's doing, or I'll ask a question about, what are they doing to fill their cup this week? Or, I try to do the best job I can just to kind of infuse those wellness questions. So thank you for sharing that. So I want to be mindful of the time, and we intentionally structured this session for 90 minutes to allow an opportunity for everyone attending to ask questions, to interact. And so I'm going to ask if there's any questions, if you want to put them in the chat that you want to ask the panelists, or if there's anything that you just want to comment on, feel free. You can unmute yourself and chat. We'll open it up. And I'm great with awkward silence. I used to teach, so. Any thoughts? All our East Coast folks are at the end of their days, so. Do we have any comments from our panelists to one another, or any questions you want to ask the audience?
Well, I am always interested in people's stories. So if anyone is not on the panel that wants to talk about sort of how their identities inform their work, if people are willing to share. I know that's not really what they came for, but I just like hearing what are the other challenges that people are facing in doing this work.
Hi, may I answer that?
Yes, please, Amy, welcome.
I'm here and I'm listening to you all, and I really want to thank all of the panelists. I think that you all have provided such great perspective. And I really appreciate hearing about your experience. My experience is a little bit different. I'm actually coming from multicultural student affairs, and then I went into being an assistant director for social justice programming at UW-Madison. And now I am a director of assessment at Penn State for educational equity. Complete shift kind of in responsibilities. But the reason that I was able to kind of make that shift was my dedication to diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice. So I always thought that that was really interesting because my skills in assessment were not as advanced as some of the other applicants may have been. But the fact that I truly believe that it is our jobs as professionals to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion and move into social justice was really one of the things that they were looking at when they were looking for a candidate. You can build, in my experience, you can build the assessment skills. You can't teach passion for DE&I and social justice. So I think it's incredibly important for me that I've been able to build a community of people. SAAL has been truly important in doing that, using the what is it, the course, the MOOC, I believe it's called, has been really, really helpful to me. And also getting involved in different assessment conferences. The first one that I went to was ACPA, and I went in person back when you could go in person. And I met some really great people. One person specifically is Amanda Thompson from Westchester University in Philly. And she's been great, a great mentor. So I really have enjoyed getting to know more about assessment and why it's so important, specifically for supporting these programs that really champion DE&I on our campus. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Amy, for sharing. Do any of our panelists want to respond?
I just heard my story and her story pretty much, because that's how I ended up in my role. You know, every other title that I've had prior to manager of assessment and evaluation was assistant director of multicultural student services, associate director of cultural diversity, you know, all these very DE&I based positions. But it's this, as you said, that you can't teach the passion. You can't teach the connection to the student and their experience, but you can learn how to do assessment in a really culturally responsible way when you have this passion. And I also, want to kind of throw it back to my own undergraduate experience, because my degree was an interdisciplinary degree. I did courses in art, music, dance, and theater, and I had to connect all the various art forms in my senior thesis. And it's that same mindset that I approach DE&I work. It's the same process that I approach assessment, understanding that there's no one way of doing it. There are so many ways of doing assessment, and it's as long as we understand the various journeys that people are bringing to the table. And so I really appreciate that. And I thank you for sharing that.
It sounds like, just based on the chat, a lot of folks can identify with that similar story as well. And there was a question that emerged in the chat that I want to be mindful of for the panelists is, what has been the most important lesson that you have in collaborating across campus, right? A lot of our work in assessment requires collaboration. So what are some lessons that you've learned, or just some words of wisdom as it pertains to collaboration?
I've been so surprised that assessment work, I think that people think it's data, but to me, it's really about relationships. I feel like so much of the work that I've done, even before I was responsible for assessment, was done collaboratively. That's the culture of our campus. And but I don't know if it's because some folks have an aversion to assessment, or just don't get it, or just it's not their jam. I feel like I've had to work so really hard to establish really good relationships. It's interesting the role I play when I'm working with a department. Sometimes I'm a coach, sometimes I'm a counselor, sometimes I'm a, there's a lot of trust, I think, that to have it done well when you're partnering with a department. So I think I appreciate that it's been a couple years since I took the course, the open course that SAAL did, but I know there was a whole section on kind of the role that you play and the relationship part and those skills. Because yeah, I totally agree with what Angie was, or was it Aaron was saying about you can learn the technical, the methodology, but it's an art. I also think there's an art to doing this work, and that's definitely harder. So the collaborations and the relationship, I think, is just a really, really critical piece to what we're trying to do.
Absolutely. Lashon, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say with assessment, and somebody alluded to it in the chat, right? It's this broad spectrum. It's the persons that are excited and ready to go and, just, tell me, what can I do? What can I do? And then there are the persons who are fearful and, they don't want to hear it and they're rescheduling the meetings and not submitting things on time. And, it's all of that. So it really is this kind of mixed bag of, okay, what am I going to get? But, having that openness to say, well, wherever you are on that spectrum or gamut, I'm willing to help, and this is how we can start, and this is how we can grow, and that sort of thing. And I think once, in more of the spirit of the question, when certain groups or entities, divisions or unit, whatever, programs start to see things happening, they start to feel almost a sense of, well, I can do this too, if, this program is able to do it, or if this unit is able to do it, or whatever. There's almost like a ripple or domino effect sometimes, for the good. So I know with a lot of the assessment work that we did during that partnership, we had that mixed bag, and it was fun at times to see people grow and others not so quickly, but always, being like, okay, well, I'm always there should you need somebody to just, talk something through or to ask a question, just knowing that you have this assessment partner and consultant there that you can kind of reach out to should you need it. And if you don't, no problem.
Love that. Thank you. Angie, is there anything you wanted to share on collaborations and relationships?
I think they covered it. It's just super important, especially to get buy-in, to acknowledge that everybody's coming in at a different place of understanding, and be mindful of that. And I approach my meetings and committee gatherings with that same similar understanding, and letting folks know that we're just going to try this out, right? I don't need you. This is not an expectation that you do this in this way and that way, but I want you to trust that what we're doing it together and for student success. So.
I love it. Thank you all. Gosh, you've been so amazing. So just thank you for energizing me. I feel like the last, hour and a half has just been really good for me as a professional to just reflect and just be around such awesome people. Just throughout the session, to kind of summarize, is we heard a lot about the importance of reflection and understanding yourself and kind of navigating the values that are important to you and how to make sure that they may align with the organization that you're part of. I heard a lot about continuing learning and the importance of building yourself and challenging yourself to grow and develop, self-assurance being so important in the process to advocate for our students, to advocate not from that deficit model, but from that strengths-based model, and really doing it for the right reasons, and really kind of refocusing on that why we get up and do the work that we do, why is so important. And I actually use Simon Sinek's golden circle in all discussions of the assessment framework our office does. Is I always often say it's really easy to talk about what we do, but why do we do it? We don't often frame from that perspective. And so when I'm talking about building an assessment plan or building an assessment process, like, well, why are you doing this? Why do you want to ask these questions? How are you planning to use this information? And I think that's a really good starting point. So thank you all for sharing that. I also heard a lot about the importance of engagement and building community and how important that is for us to advance this work when it comes to equity. And it sounds like obviously SAAL is a great place, and it's been a great place, but we are still challenging ourselves as the professional development chair. We're still challenging ourselves to be more intentional about how we infuse equity work into our professional development. So this is something we want to continue on. We want to either call it the lens, the equity lens, or a spotlight on equity, but we are going to be more intentional moving forward about how we structure our conversations around this, as well as some of our other blogs and the other professional development that we do in our organization. And so with that, if there is any final thoughts, final statements, I can gift you back just a little bit more of your time, but I want to thank, I really just truly want to thank our panelists. You all have been amazing to share your time with us and your expertise, but are there any final thoughts, any final words? Well, if not, with that, I'll gift you all back 7 minutes of your day, especially for folks on East Coast time. I know that it's a little bit later than in the day. So thank you for everyone for sticking around. This will be on YouTube. We'll send it out through the listserv so you can share it with colleagues who weren't able to join. And we just really look forward, if anybody wants to participate as a panelist in the future, we really just want to make this a community effort. So feel free to reach out to me, email me at renee.dr@uoregon.edu. We would really love to feature you in a future panel. So thank you, everyone. And be well and safe.